The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. On the heels of a FEMA report that lists Bronx County as one of the 30 least climate change resilient counties in the nation, and ongoing concerns about South Bronx air quality, the Urban Land Institute New York, in partnership with the New York City EDC, is recommending a new way of delivering energy to what is called New York City's refrigerator, the Hunts Point Distribution Center, FDC. Experts say that local communities can also benefit from the market's energy conversion, which will make Bronxites happy, I'm sure. Tonight we're going to take a look at the plan, which was part of a study, this study called Energy Resilience for Hunts Point, that proposes investment in resilient and sustainable geothermal technology that they say could help reduce Hunts Point's greenhouse gas emissions and improve air quality for an area with historically high asthma rates. It would also promote regional food security and save an estimated $6.2 million annually. Very interesting project. We're going to take a look. Please join me in welcoming the Executive Director of the Urban Land Institute New York, Felix Ciampa. Nice to have you with us, sir.
Thank you.
And the Vice President of Matrix New World Engineering, and they specialize in climate adaptation with a focus on nature-based systems for waterfront facilities and stormwater management. Venetia Lannon, nice to have you with us, Ms. Lannon. Let's start with you, Mr. Ciampa. Let's get right started and talk about the Urban Land Institute New York. What is it? Who is it?
Sure. Urban Land Institute is a global nonprofit research and education organization whose mission is to promote the responsible use of land and the creation of sustainable, resilient, and thriving communities around the world. Here in New York, we carry out the mission of ULI at the local level. We have about 2,700 members all throughout the real estate community, multidisciplinary in their expertise, from junior members in the industry just out of school to senior members and CEOs. And we are focused on helping communities and engaging communities like we did here in Hunts Point.
So we look at the FDC, the
Right.
Hunts Point Food Distribution Center. It provides 50% or even more of New York City's food.
Right.
It is a large industrial complex, which is maybe unfortunately situated right near or in a residential community. Maybe I just answered my own question. What attracted you to it and made you say, hey, maybe we ought to do something here?
The two things really that got us interested when EDC approached us with the opportunity were the fact that there's this issue of regional food security, as you mentioned. You've got the food distribution center, and also the fact that the Hunts Point, the broader Hunts Point Peninsula and community has historically high asthma rates and really environmental issues that have plagued the community. And I think the opportunity from ULI's perspective through our technical assistance panel program to bring some expertise to help the city try to resolve some of the sustainable energy needs on the peninsula and some of the broader objectives that they had around environmental benefits, et cetera, for the community really were attractive to us.
I guess so. You know, the first thing you said was that EDC came to you, so we have to credit the city for saying, you know, we got to do something here, right? And
For
so
sure.
let's start over there. One of the things that was in the report, which it's hard to measure the number. It said that energy rates for some of the FDC businesses were like $100,000 a month.
Right.
Now, of course, depending on the size of the business and the size of the operation, certainly it's compared to what we pay on our electric bills, it's a lot of money. But that would suggest that if you can ratchet down the costs, the general public will benefit because, of course, all of those costs are passed on to us in the food that we eat.
Right.
How does the finance work here in terms of saving money? Is it simply because you'll be generating energy at less cost? I mean,
Yeah,
fundamentally?
I think I'll let my colleague Venetia, if you
All
want to
right,
tackle
Ms.
that on
Lannon,
the
why don't
technical
you talk
side.
about that?
Yeah, no, fundamentally, what geothermal energy allows you to do is to use less energy to make cooling, and that's really what the food distribution needs. As you said, it's the city's refrigerator. About 80% of the total energy used at the food distribution center is for refrigeration. So geothermal energy allows you to make that energy much more cost effectively. So for every sort of 1 unit of energy you put in, you get 4 units of power out. So you're literally cutting your total energy demand down to like a quarter of what it would be. So it reduces your energy demand and therefore your energy bill.
Every one of us will listen to that and say, gee whiz, what about my neighborhood? What about,
Yeah.
you know? So this is kind of I don't want to say discovery, but a realization that maybe if we start here, we can expand it further.
Absolutely.
Are we thinking in those terms? Or?
Yes, absolutely. There's a program right now in Westchester where, because there's a moratorium on new natural gas in Westchester, they have a program to incentivize residential homes to put in these units. High rises are looking to put in geothermal systems. So you're absolutely right. The food distribution center could be a leader, but this is an energy that is literally right under our feet and it's available for everyone.
I do want to break down some of the technology, and we'll do that in just a moment. I do want to get back to Mr. Ciampa and talk about methodology.
Sure.
And I think, having sat in this chair for a long time, I think people in the Bronx will really appreciate the way that you went about it, as opposed to other projects where the city says, okay, we're going to do it this way, and they get a little group of people to manage it,
Right.
and then they come back to the community and say, this is what we're going to do. This was a fascinating process, I think, and for Bronxites, a very Bronx process, because you did this with the community and said, let's together come up with a plan. I guess the idea was the TAP program, the technical
Sure.
assistant panels. Talk about that as methodology. To me, I think that's as important, or almost as important, as the result itself, because we need this kind of analysis and approach in all the projects we get in the Bronx. We don't get it.
Sure. Yeah, ULI has a long history of leveraging the expertise of members like Venetia and others who are on the TAP panel to bring that expertise and help communities solve complex land use and real estate issues through objective, market-based, pragmatic solutions. How we do it is we bring our members together. In this case, we have a sponsor like EDC on this particular TAP, where they define the scope, which is the work that they wanted us to look at, and the questions they wanted us to answer. We went out and recruited a panel of expert members, and we brought them together for what's essentially a two-day planning charrette for a high-level feasibility analysis. I would say that this is not a final plan, so just to be clear for viewers who are watching.
Well, yes, this is the first step.
It's the
and
first
we're
step,
certainly going to
right.
get to that.
Right, we'll get to that, but this is a first
I'm sorry,
step.
I'm excited about it.
Yeah. No,
So that's why we wanted to do this show.
Sure, it's a great process. We've done others with the city, different city agencies, communities around the city for the last 5 years. And the process involves, as you mentioned, the community, so interviewing community stakeholders, both within government, in the community, and folks who are advocates for environmental and social justice, sustainability advocates, et cetera, within the community. And they were a part of the interview process so we could incorporate some of their feedback.
I'm just thinking about the folks at Hunts Point, and if you're talking about sustainability and environmental justice and those things, you are at ground zero
Sure.
if you're talking to my friends at Hunts Point. And
absolutely.
I did talk to a few of the members, people who had participated in this dialogue, and I'll tell you what I found, and maybe you can back it up. They were relieved that somebody came to them, because they have been studying this for generations, really.
Long history.
What came out of those dialogues? I mean, we know what the resultant
Sure.
report was, but what sense did you get when you heard people talk about what they really want?
I think the panelists in interviewing the stakeholders heard the need for real community engagement and dialogue as this process unfolds and goes forward. Clearly a focus on access to the waterways, that's been a focus in this part of the Bronx for a long time. Improving air quality, reducing emissions, and the carbon footprint on the peninsula. So those are some things that you probably have heard in the past, but certainly
a little bit.
Yeah, were reiterated for sure to the panelists.
I would say also resiliency was a key concern.
Yeah.
And as you say, these groups, especially the environmental justice groups in the South Bronx, have been the leaders of what's known as climate justice.
I said ground zero.
Absolutely.
I know who I'm talking about.
So, I think that we were talking about, a system that is inherently resilient. It doesn't rely on fossil fuel.
Right.
It weans us off fossil fuel and seeks renewable sources of energy. It was very much in line with what the community wants to see. But as Felix says, it's imperative that the city continue to engage the local community as the projects move forward, if they do.
I'm curious about, and I mentioned it at the introduction, I'm curious about this resilience idea.
Yeah.
Because the Bronx waterways, we have many shorelines, have been flagged as like we're not prepared, and we know what we had with Hurricane Sandy. We're still trying to, dig out of it, so to speak. And we're going to get into the technology, but how would this work to really affect that process, aside from simply saving energy and being more efficient in how we produce energy?
Right. Well, I think, resiliency at its heart is basically we need to become more flexible in response to a changing climate, right? And in order, the most fundamental thing that you can do to help with climate change is to stop burning fossil fuel. So, and that's something that community is very well aware of, not just because fossil fuel is creating greenhouse gases, which lead to climate change, which we're trying to become resilient, but as you were mentioning earlier, combusting fossil fuel also creates pollutants, like, that you get in your lungs that cause asthma. So I think that there are many benefits to this kind of technology, but at heart, I think it's about moving away from combusting fossil fuel.
So there, I'm going to list some of the things that are talked about in the report: solar energy, anaerobic digestion, hydropower. These were all things considered. We can go through any of them that you'd like. Why not just say, hey, let's just do a whole solar process for Hunts Point? Or even the hydropower, I guess, would be the moving water creates. There's wind. There's all kinds of things. Why did you come up with this geothermal energy idea?
Right, and to start with, I think what the conclusion of the ULI report is that we need a balanced strategy. There's no one silver bullet that's going to solve everything. We also thought that solar was important given the flat roofs. Why we
available space,
anaerobic digestion. You have up to 100 tons of food waste ready. That's perfect material for composting, and that's anaerobic digestion, creating the gas from digesting the food. So you have a lot of options at Hunts Point. But what attracted us about geothermal energy is it's the most efficient way to create cooling. It takes advantage of the constant heat in the ground. Solar and wind are intermittent. The energy that is stored in the ground is there all the time. So that's important. You need a constant source of energy. And the other thing that was appealing about geothermal is there's no emissions, obviously. That was also essential. So, those two things, I think, really drove us. We can talk more about the technology. I don't want to bore anybody.
What you've already defined is important, and I think it's important for people to understand what that technology actually is, so that when they talk about it, or they read about it in the papers, or even they watch this process go through, they'll have a better sense. So some of those things are going to be used. You mentioned the flat roofs. You've got all those industrial spots. There's a ton of acreage up there. So geothermal is going to be the main driver, but it's not going to be exclusive in terms of how this is converted.
Correct. That was our recommendation, that it be the sort of the main energy source given the energy needs, but that there would be a balanced sort of diversity of renewables.
As I understand, Cornell has a geothermal technology at Cayuga Lake. Toronto at Lake Ontario has one.
Yep.
Apparently there's a Sims facility in Sunset Park. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's a recycling facility, but a geothermal system that's closer to home here in New York City is also Cornell. Their campus on Roosevelt Island is employing geothermal today. So if you want to go see geothermal in action, go to Roosevelt Island.
How instructive was that in coming up? Like, did you say,
Very.
hey, you know what, it can be done, so we can do it here?
Absolutely. It's very important that there be precedents that we can point to, that we can go kick the tires and see that it works. That was very important. You know, at the end of the day, the folks at the Food Distribution Center need to do their job. They need to deliver food. They want something that is easy, that works, that's not going to break down. So that was very important.
Mr. Ciampa, let's just talk about financing, and you know, everything has a cost. I think the number that came up in the report was $55 million.
Right.
Talk to me about how that money gets raised. The suggestion in the report is that some of it can come from grants. You may not be saying to the companies you want this to happen, you put it up, that there may be ways of doing this. Talk about the financing of something like this.
Yeah, I mean, there might be grants available. You know, there certainly
Like NYSERDA, those kinds of things.
NYSERDA has grants, yeah.
Certainly the city through its own capital program and capital investment program. So EDC as the entity for the city that manages the food distribution center businesses and leases the land. I mean, they have access to funding as well. And one of the things we recommended was that they do a deeper dive financial feasibility study as part of sort of the next phase of this to really drill down on the costs for geothermal?
If I may,
Yeah,
one of
please.
the interesting things we looked at was if EDC sort of, you know, and there are grants from NYSERDA and the federal government for geothermal, but if EDC were to pay to put in the system, and then they themselves could become the utility, you know, and then they would sell the power to the tenants at a
So
cheaper rate than what they're paying now,
Right.
but they could sort of facilitate the project that way.
I'm not sure who wants to address this. I mean, you could do it philosophically, and you probably could do it technologically. But let's talk about the wider community. So now we're talking about, you know, 80% of the energy used at the Hunts Point Distribution Center is for refrigeration and all that kind of thing. What about the people who live on Hunts Point? And certainly the direct claim that's made in the report is that this can work for the wider community. Let's start with you then, Mr. Ciampa, and let's just talk about, I'm assuming people said, wait a minute, if you're going to do this there, we want a piece of it. Talk about what that possibility is, and then we'll talk about how that actually can happen.
Yeah, the recommendations that the panel came up with was this balanced energy strategy, which envisions kind of a distribution spine along Hunts Point Avenue, bringing geothermal so that as the city redoes the facilities there in the food distribution center, makes them more efficient, more energy efficient, and brings them online, they could attach to that. Other users could attach to that. You could run the geothermal line all the way up even to the proposed Metro North
so
station.
when you say users, would that mean you know, a property owner of a building then does it, or is it on a larger scale? You say, okay, this whole region taps in. There's a reason I'm asking you this, but so is that how it might work?
Well, I think the spine was it's envisioned that I think Hunts Point Avenue and businesses or anything adjacent there too probably could extend even further, but maybe you could answer
All
that.
right,
I'm
so
not
now
sure.
let's get into you know, what is the reality, and maybe it's very logical. The reason I'm asking is how far can this go? You're talking about converting a whole industrial plant, the energy of an industrial plant, and using it for a community. Goodness gracious, I got a lot of places in the Bronx and elsewhere where I'd say, gee, if we're going to do this, you know, let's do it.
Right. Well, one of the benefits about the food distribution center is that you have sort of discrete users, but all within one campus, right? So you could have a
It is Hunts Point. after
Correct.
all.
You could have a geothermal system. You can do them discreetly so that you could have the meat market on one loop and the produce market on another loop. Or you could have sort of a shared system, as Felix was saying, was one of the things that we looked at in the report. In terms of the benefits to the community, I think air quality is really, you know, problem number one. Well, maybe resiliency and air quality compete. But right now, because the food distribution center, especially in the produce market, is undersized, a lot of the produce will be in refrigerated trucks that are just running their diesel engines, which is problematic to the community. I know that
to say the least.
To say the
Excuse me,
least.
I'm sorry. I've just been sitting here for too long hearing all of it.
but you know, and I know that the produce market has been advocating for bigger space, so they don't have to do that. But if you could get a renewable energy source that would allow, you know, at a cheaper rate for them to be able to bring the produce into the buildings and power them from renewable energy, there would be a direct impact to the air quality in the region. And I think that's really how the community benefits the most.
I'm thinking about other programs we've done on other types of energy. We've talked about solar farms and on those things, and they're beginning to take hold and really work their way into different Bronx communities. Seems to me, now this is maybe just a political question, I don't know who wants to answer it, is that if we, and I'm only thinking of the Bronx, but if we took a step back and looked at all these possibilities, we probably could do a really good job because it all exists, right? I mean, you study this every day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think at the political level, and the state has just passed a climate bill which says that we're going to radically reduce our carbon footprint, right? We're going to be, by 2040, I think it is, all of the electricity in New York State is going to be generated essentially by non-fossil fuel sources. So this is the direction we are heading in. So we need to find all the other energy sources that we can that aren't fossil fuel, whether it's energy that's stored in the ground, energy from the sun, energy from food waste. We're going to need all of these sources, and it's absolutely taking off.
Well, let's talk about the possibilities here of not only Hunts Point and even taking it larger. What has to happen now? So you've put out this report, and again, this is not an accepted thing yet. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. There are all kinds of environmental impact studies and everything else that absolutely has to be done and has to be done right. Talk to me about the process and where it's at, how this was received by EDC. Did they just say, oh, that's interesting? Or did they say, wow, this is great? I mean, where are we at with this?
Sure. First, I would say
I love the idea. That's why we're doing the show.
It was well received by EDC, and I just want to acknowledge the work that they were already doing. Post Sandy, and we've touched on it a little bit, anaerobic digestion, the idea of solar as other energy sources. So they were already sort of thinking about this. This is complementary to what they were doing. But the follow-up recommendations are, as I mentioned earlier, a deeper dive, sort of feasibility study, an assessment of kind of the rough cost estimates that the consultants on the panel gave to EDC about the cost.
Make sure it's realistic.
Yeah, and then also they have to take a look at the food distribution center businesses and the lifespan of those businesses and what the life cycle is and the replacement cost, the capital conservation plan that was suggested in the report as well.
What are stumbling blocks? I know as you put something out like this, you're saying, gee, this is a good idea, but I mean, in your mind, what are you saying, gee whiz, this is a hurdle we have to get over? Or do you just like this plan so much that you're like, they're gonna love it?
Look, we like it. We think it's the right thing.
A bad question.
For the city and for the peninsula. And we're encouraged by what we've seen and heard from EDC. And again, they're already thinking about resilience and sustainability here on the peninsula. And I think they see this as a real opportunity and something that they want to dive deeper into. So I'm optimistic, and we'll follow up with them as we go forward.
Ms. Lannon, from a technical point of view, how long does it take to convert, to actually do the work? And is this a major, construction project that's going to, get in the way for a couple of years? I mean, what does it look like when you try to put something like this together?
Well, the majority of the work that happens is drilling into the ground in this instance. So, one of the relative luxuries the food distribution center has is they have quite a lot of space around their buildings. So, it wouldn't need to disrupt the operation of the FDC.
Right.
But as Felix says, it really depends how EDC wants to take this. EDC also has a vision of upgrading all of those buildings. It's a very expensive proposition. So whether the geothermal system would happen at the same time as the buildings were upgraded, that may be a sensible time to do it. Otherwise, it's possible to do it around the operation, but it's always a bit of a challenge. But it doesn't take a tremendously long time. As you say, once you get through all the environmental review and city processes, I mean, everything takes a long time in the city.
Right. Well, that's very interesting. I wasn't aware of the dialogue about replacing some of the, the infrastructure, the building infrastructure, and that becomes a very big question. Do we do the energy first and then convert the buildings, or deal with the buildings, or do we deal with the buildings first and then do the energy, or do we just say, let's do it all at once, like rip the Band-Aid off and try and make it happen?
Those are the very questions that EDC will be wrestling with when they get this report. As the landlord of the food distribution center, together, that's what they've got to figure out now. We've given them the tools and some ideas, but they're going to have to kind of
Do
put
you
it
have
together.
a preference? Do you have an idea, or is it an unfair question to ask?
No, not, I mean, because I'm not paying the bill, I would say do it all at once. I mean, obviously it makes more sense to put in a new energy system when you're putting in a new building, and then you can kind of phase the old one out. That would seem to make the most sense, but that's, you know, it's not always possible.
Where does this fall within the scope of ULI's programs? In other words, is this like the biggest thing we could imagine is redoing energy at Hunts Point, or is this the kind of thing that you do all the time? In other words, where is this project at in your portfolio?
The Technical Assistance Panel Program is one of the biggest things ULI does nationally and internationally. There's a program that's a 5-day model where members fly all over the world to consult with communities and help them solve complex land use challenges. It's one of the ways that our members give back. They get to go into the community and help communities pro bono, I might add, and they lend their advice and expertise. And
Not
really
that we
a
need
big
to
thing for us.
not that we need to inspire people at Hunts Point to do more or advocate harder, because it is a matter of their breed, so to speak. But do you find when you do these things that the end result, aside from the project, that the end result is more engagement, more care, more involvement in communities? I would guess that once you say, hey, you can have a part of this, that people would take advantage of it.
Yeah, for sure. When we've done these, the community engagement increases, and really when you have great partners like we've had in the past on some of our TAPs, whether it was in Gowanus with the Fifth Avenue Committee looking at how to mitigate urban heat island, or in Sleepy Hollow looking at commercial revitalization strategies there. We're actually doing a follow-up program this Friday in Sleepy Hollow, where the mayor's bringing us back to talk about progress made since the TAP recommendations we did there 2 years ago.
And for Matrix, is this like just another day at the office, or is this viewed as, I'm hoping you're going to say this is really a special project, this is really an important thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is really an important thing. I mean, we love the Hunts Point neighborhood in general. We're always happy to be doing work there, but Matrix New World Engineering is very focused on the future, on sustainability, on resiliency, on moving past fossil fuel, and to be able to do that practically in an applied sense in one of the most important places in New York City, if not this region. I mean, that's more than a day in the office.
Listen, you guys are great, and proposing these kinds of ideas are not done often enough because people don't think about large pictures. So we thank you both for joining us this evening. And I guess you'll get back to us and let us know as it's going. We want feasibility, we want EIS, we want the whole thing. And come back here on BronxTalk and we'll announce, guess what? We're going to convert the energies at Hunts Point.
Happy to follow up.
I'm sure you will. Thank you so much for both of you for joining us. Folks, if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the borough of the Bronx, email them to us at bronxtalk@bronxnet.org. You send us a tweet at BronxTalk or post them on our Facebook page. Now, next week, we'll talk about higher education with two educators who have studied what works and what doesn't work in Bronx higher ed. Should be fascinating. Thanks to our producer is Helen Greenberg. Our director is Nick Marrero. Yes, we will see you next week. Good night.